As you can see, we have a pretty full agenda today with a lot of interesting presentations on the subject. I have been asked to do an introductory presentation on the impact of perceptions on performance in relation to nation branding. So here is my contribution, which will be followed by a discussion with Laura Citron. I won't bore you too much with brand finance because I think probably most of you know who we are. Quite a lot of you were at our reception last night at the Brand Exchange, which is our headquarters. I hope you enjoyed the evening. We have been there now for 10 years. More than that. We've been there for 12 years. And when we moved into that building, we actually refurbished it completely back to its Edwardian splendor. And we put paneling in, and we put a bar in, and we've got a presentation suite there. I think we're very proud of it. And interesting, we're kind of using our own place branding, because rather than it just being number 3 Birchin Lane, we actually call it the Brand Exchange. And the reason we do that is because we're orientating it into a place in the city where many years ago there used to be coffee houses. That area where we are, for those of you who came there, is where the very first coffee house started. In fact, literally, it's about 50 yards from our front door, and it is now a pub, predictably. But back then, it was a coffee house. And interestingly, the coffee houses developed into places where people met to do business, and then they became exchanges. So the stock exchange, the metal exchange, the marine exchange, Lloyd's, a whole variety of what were coffee houses came to be clusters, and people of a particular discipline went there. And so, lo and behold, the exchange concept developed. And that's why we called our building Brand Exchange, where brands meet finance, which says it all about us. But I think, actually, I was thinking about it, it also says something about the nature of place branding, because place branding is very much about clustering people and things in a particular place that are self-reinforcing. People get to know that the place is for that, and hopefully, in our case, they know that it's where all the most brilliant brand people are, so they'll come to, they'll come there. And that plays through at a city level, at a region level, at a nation level. In many different ways, it plays all the way through. And so that's really the subject of today's thing. Now, we actually got into the subject of place branding almost by accident. Many of you may know Simon Anholt. He came to us just over 22 years ago, and he said to me, I've been doing this little study on nation brands for a while. It's about perceptions, and I get a lot of attention, but the truth is I would get a lot more attention if I could put monetary numbers to it, because people listen to you if what gets measured gets done kind of thing. So if they can see the likely impact on finances and economics, they are much more likely to do what you ask them. And so we began doing our nation brand study with Simon. Well, he moved on because he had partners who didn't want to collaborate with us because, weirdly, they didn't want to give us his research, even though we were promoting their research. And so we began doing our own. So we have been independent ever since, and we've been doing this thing for at least 20 years. And it's quite interesting how it has developed. I wrote an article in the introduction of the report that you can get online now, in which I was saying that I think it is now widely accepted that place branding does actually have a significant effect on economic performance, and I'll come back to that in a second. So it's widely accepted. But widely accepting it is not the same as widely implementing it or widely funding it. And I think that's really why this sort of event is of such importance, because we are still in the process of professionalizing and developing the way that this all works. Now, as an aside, just to give you one example, and then I'll get on with the presentation a bit more. I'm researching a presentation I'm doing in America about B2B, okay? And I'm trying to talk about, what interesting brands are there that do B2B in America. I landed on John Deere, who you may have heard of. They make tractors and stuff like that, just farm equipment. They have spent more than $1 billion more than $1 billion in the last 4 years, promoting their brand only in America. As a result of which, John Deere brand is kind of dominant, and we've got all these graphs that show it going off the scale in terms of growth. Now, obviously, advertising is not always the solution, but it can be quite a significant part of the solution. The main thing is they are committed to doing a lot of investment. And I think the rallying cry for everybody in this room, not everybody, for some of you who are busy pursuing this, is now that everyone has accepted that place branding is a thing, somehow getting policymakers and politicians to realize that blowing money of that quantum is not actually throwing taxpayers' money down the drain. It's actually a positive way of growing it. And one of the things you'll see in my presentation and later is that some countries are doing that, and they are already clearly benefiting from doing so. So anyway, just in terms of us, we have tried to professionalize the whole subject of brand valuation ever since we started, and we have been going 30 years this year. Woohoo! It's our anniversary this year, so thank you very much. There is a clear demand for people to understand all this stuff, and we believe that unless you have clear standards that are transparent, you cannot explain to people like politicians and so on why the thing works. We've got a multidisciplinary team. We publish lots of different studies, the nation brand being one, which is what we're launching today. But the engine behind that, the perceptual engine, is now the global soft power research, which tells us a lot about the attributes that drive countries against 8 pillars. Why do people like one country rather than another? And we've done the same thing at a city level. So, I've said it already, we're into measurement-based approaches to convince skeptical decision makers that they should do something. And as I've said, we're just down the road. We work for a lot of people already, and many of these projects are extremely interesting, and it's always satisfying to see, over a 5-year period, how it actually translates into economic performance. Just very briefly, the thing that we've always talked about, and Simon talked about it, everyone talks about it, is that there are 4 main areas where nation branding can actually have a significant economic effect. So foreign direct investment is obviously one, trade, i.e. selling products and services, talent attraction, which in the case of retirement, medical and education is now a huge, huge thing, and then of course tourism. Now what that's showing below is the relative correlation of our soft power study to the performance in these things in real world terms. Some are stronger correlations than others, but they're all pretty strong. And one of the reasons they wouldn't be even stronger is because there are a lot of random factors that come into play. But it is still the case that the things we're measuring can clearly be connected to the performance in those things. And to be honest, to all of us, I suppose, it's common sense that the things we are measuring would change people's perceptions about a place and then make them feel like they want to be there or do something with them. So we're using an ISO-approved methodology, as you would expect, to put a high-level number. The high-level number, as with many of our studies, is really to draw attention. The really interesting thing is what's under the bonnet. How do we identify what the revenue streams are, the economic streams? How do we show how they would increase? How do we think they are increasing? How do we model it? So all that financial stuff. And then what is driving that in terms of the correlations? So if you do action A, is that likely to have a greater effect on people's perception of your brand and therefore the economic return or not? It integrates our soft power index, which I've already said. We used to launch that in London, but we decided that being called global, it was a bit odd if forevermore we only ever launched it in London. So we have now actually switched to Davos. So if anyone is going to Davos, this January that's just gone, we launched it there for the first time with our new BFF, Justin Trudeau, who brought Katy Perry along. I don't know whether any of you saw any of the social media. It was quite amusing. I mean, Justin Trudeau came along and gave quite a good speech, but all the social media was about his girlfriend, who didn't say a word. She just came in holding his hand, sat down, sat there with a smile on her face, but she got a lot of coverage for it. Anyway, so we are now doing that in Davos, and we will be doing it again next year. In fact, on that subject, we always struggle a bit to work out who our keynote speaker should be. And even though we have a relatively large budget to pay them to come and speak, we struggle to work out who it should be. So if anyone, here we go, interactive. If anyone has got a great suggestion for who we should approach to speak at our next soft power study in Davos, please let me or one of my colleagues know, because we're looking for suggestions. The tendency, just between you and me, the tendency is that it's hard to invite acting politicians because they're terribly unreliable. They just never show up. Some of them may be in Davos, so that might make it easier. But then the second point is it's almost impossible to get through to them to ask them, would you come along and present? Or there's some political problem in the way. So active politicians are no good. Film stars and people of that ilk charge a huge amount, and they're very unreliable. So what we're generally left with is past politicians and influencers. And, we've now been doing it for 8 years, and we've asked many, many of them. So we're kind of running out of juice. So if any of you have got any good ideas, please let me know. And we apply all of this to do individual studies. Individual studies go into much more depth, and obviously that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of doing work. So we do a brand strength assessment, we apply a royalty to the economic performance of the country, so we get a macroeconomic view of the economy and the amount that we would attribute to all the brands in the economy. We split it between the commercial brands and the nation brand itself, i.e. there are commercial brands, how much more does the nation brand add to their value? And we separate those two things out and put them together to give the total brand value. Why is it important? Well, benchmarking, obviously. Accountability is one of the most important things. Developing strategy, legitimizing what you're doing to your bosses, and I'll give a little brief example in a second, and then communication and education, all of which I think huge progress has been made in the last 20 years, but there is still quite a lot of room to go. And so I thought I would just highlight the GREAT campaign. We were asked to work on the GREAT campaign in 2013. It launched in 2011 originally. Very inspired campaign, and explicitly looked to unite all 4 of those economic effects that I mentioned a moment ago, running up to, through, and beyond the London Olympics in 2012. So that was the reason, well, I'm told that's the reason why they instigated the GREAT campaign, to coordinate those things to see what the results would be. We did our first study in 2013, and we did it for about 5 years, demonstrating what the returns were. The returns were very clear, coming through from all the different areas in terms of GDP growth and also direct return on the amount that was invested. And the 2 things that I'm most happy about with this campaign is that, and we then did it again, it was refreshed in 2021 after the COVID crisis, and it's been going since then. But the 2 things that I find most satisfying about this is that, it's now non-partisan. I think everyone agrees that it was a good idea. There was a danger because it was set up by David Cameron that everyone would say, oh, that's just Tory propaganda, forget it. And it's saying how great David Cameron is. He actually was hands-off. He let it do its own thing, and it's seen just to be a good thing. And the second thing is, I think it's fair to say that we won't take total credit, but I think we contributed to it securing its budget and increasing its budget year by year. But it's still less than £100 million a year. I think it's about 60 or 70 million these days. But when you think it's promoting all 4 of those objectives around the world, it's peanuts, even by comparison with John Deere tractors. And that, to me, is one of the key questions. How do we demonstrate that the return from increased investment is actually returned? It's not just BS, if you know what I mean. It's not just the people in a department having fun making ads. I think, personally, one of the problems with the GREAT campaign, it's a great campaign, is underfunding. And that frequently is the case when you look at certain brands. They do great work, but they just don't spend enough on it. And that's particularly true in B2B, but even more so true where it comes to nation branding, I think. So, quickly through the trends. If you look at the results that are coming out, they're quite stable year by year, but one of the notable facts is that if we look at the G7, there has been a drop-off in brand value amongst many of the G7, with the notable exception of China, which is the exact reverse. China is doing extremely well, and perhaps not coincidentally, China has a very structured, well-resourced approach to the way in which it actually does things to develop its nation brand and the amount of money it puts behind promoting its nation brand. similar to one or two other countries like the UAE and China. So the ones that are going backwards are the ones that have very little growth. They don't seem to be really getting their act together. The ones that are doing well are countries like China. I thought that you might be interested to see the full analysis over the 22 years. You can see that there have actually been several drop-offs where there have been crises. There was a drop-off in nation brand value in 2009 during the great financial crisis. There was another one during COVID, not surprisingly, and there is another one at the moment which we think is probably attributable to the Trump effect, the effect on other countries of tariffs and so on. And on that, I'll just show you the results for America, which I think are quite stark. When Mr. Trump was president the last time round, in the second to last year of his presidency, America's soft power, according to our research, dropped off a cliff. They went from number 1 to number 7, and then when the new president came in, it bounced back up again to number 1. It has been a natural leader in soft power for decades and decades and decades with that blip. It appears to be going into a similar blip. This research was only done last autumn, so Mr. Trump hadn't been in power for very long. But you can see on most of the things connected to the America First campaign, it has resulted in a drop in the perceptions of America against those attributes, which is not good. So it'll be interesting to see whether that continues during the next 3 years of his presidency. You'll see there that there are still a lot of strengths in America. It's very hard to knock down a thing like America, which has taken decades to get to where it is. It's still number 1 in arts, space. It's lost its place as number 1 for global products, which is a bit surprising. I think the number 1 is it Switzerland now? Who's number 1 on products? You know, caught you out. It's now number 2 in leaders in science. I think that is China. And it's dropping on technology and leader in sport. So, they need to worry because there clearly, in our view, is a connection between these things and the strength of your economy. Anecdotally, all you need to do is to look at what is happening to American corporate brands to see that they are suffering from a wilting of the American soft power and nation brand. And you can see over there on the right-hand side that some things have actually been reinforced by Trump: familiarity, perceived influence, because obviously he's throwing his weight around, influence in diplomacy, media, etc. The one standout interesting one is that they are still first where it comes to admired leaders. And you might scratch your head and go, well, how's that possible? Your research is a bit weird. And what we point to is that if our study is global. We do it in over 100 countries. Many of those countries have controlled media or narrow media, and many of them actually think Trump is a good guy, doing great things. He's very decisive. So you get what I call the Marmite effect. They hate him in some places and love him in others. They admire him in some places and don't admire him in others. The net effect is that Trump is still seen, obviously, as an admired leader, even though on many of the other things, America is beginning to suffer as a result of his policies. So it's an interesting one. Not quite sure how nation brand managers can affect that kind of thing, but you can scratch around the edges, I suppose. So there's been a systematic decline in developed world soft power and nation branding. And this is just splitting it by region. This shows that Asia has been rising very steadily. You might have noticed in the last chart that India has not done brilliantly. I think this is possibly because India is a good example of a country which is seen as a bit confused outside and isn't investing a huge amount in promoting India. To date, they have been quite recessive, I would say, in terms of promoting the India brand, other than in tourism. I think the challenge for India, dare I say it, is that they need to try and promote themselves as being strong in all 4. Okay, so step forward the minister for whatever it is in India. Clearly, India is a booming economy. It's beginning to grow. I think it would grow a lot faster if it were investing in this kind of thing, which clearly China is. And on the subject of China, here we go. They are the one that has grown most significantly in the last year. In our other tables, they've also grown significantly in the value of their corporate brands, which are now going from strength to strength around the world. Every day, new Chinese brands pop up, and increasingly they are not embarrassed to say they are Chinese, which I think is proof of the pudding in the eating of nation branding. And I know, because I was invited to present at the tourism show in EdExcel this year, that as a government policy, they are now trying to grow tourism from 25 million external visitors a year to hundreds of millions. Most of the countries of Europe get 100 million tourists a year. China has recognized that if people visit China, see what it's all about, see the products, this will have a very favorable effect on perceptions of China as a whole, and in particular of their brands as they seek to become global. And you can see here, you don't need to go the whole spider graph, you can look at it afterwards if you want. China is ahead of the US in quite a few things, which 10 years ago you'd have gone, how is that possible? But increasingly China is doing it. So here you go, interesting statistic. Their nation brand has grown by 3,000% since we started doing, since 2005 when we started doing the study. The UAE, much, much smaller country, but very focused in its planning and execution and the way that it has an integrated nation brand campaign, has grown very significantly. Japan, sadly, has been declining. And here is a point that comes to the last sessions later on today, because one of our hobby horses is this relationship between corporate and private brands and the countries they come from. Clearly, if you have a strong nation brand, like Germany does in engineering, or Britain, let's face it, does in education and history, or Italy does where it comes to fashion design, or France does where it comes to luxury and body care and perfumes and that kind of stuff. There is a direct correlation between the strength and attributes of the nation brand and the performance of those brands and the growth of those brands. So there is a fight going on. How do I capture the world's attention that we are brilliant at this particular area? How do I choose which ones do I want the world to think we're brilliant? China has got so many different sectors to choose from. It makes everything. Which ones does it want to be seen to be the best at? So far, it has wanted to be seen to be the best at technology in all its aspects, whether it's solar technology, car technology, TikTok-type technology, AI technology. So China is going down that road. Will it now begin to try and get into things like food, clothes, and other areas? Interesting to see. And what this basically says is that there is a relationship between the performance of local brands and the local nation brand. So, Denmark is very big in pharma. Saudi is very big in energy. The UAE is very big in tourism and travel. Clearly it's been hit recently, but there is a clear relationship which has helped the Emirates. And then Ireland is an odd one in that none of those brands are Irish, but they have actually helped substantially to grow the Irish economy. In fact, I read the other day that the only country in Europe that runs a government deficit fiscally is Ireland, because it makes so much money out of the brands it's attracted to its IP infrastructure. So the IP infrastructure as a cluster works for them. They're making tons of money. Everyone needs to find what is the one that works best for them. So here is the ranking looked at on a per capita basis. What this basically says is small countries end up with higher per capita value. And I think that points to the fact that it is easier to actually focus in on something if you are a small nation. So in a way, nation branding is easier if you're small. Sadly, there are other economic things going on in the background that get in the way of all this marketing stuff. If you look at Brazil and Argentina, they've done very badly. I think it's partly because of governance, actually, and that's what we're going to be talking about later on, talking about brand governance, but also there is overall nation brand governance and leadership. For them, it's undermined their performance. In the case of the two on the right, this is really to do with international trade disruption. Both Vietnam and Bangladesh have done badly in the last year because of the Trump effect that we talked about earlier. So here's my last slide before I get on to Laura, who is going to talk to us about how London makes a big difference to the overall UK brand. I think in particular, well, she's not going to talk so much about the UK brand, but in particular, she's going to talk about London and the challenges and so on. And I thought I'd just end with Joe Nye. Joe Nye kind of invented soft power. He's a very big guy on how nation branding works. sadly, he died last year, but he had said he would speak at one of our events. He died before we got the chance to get him here in person. He actually spoke virtually a couple of years ago, if any of you watch our soft power studies, and he was very, very good. He talked actually about soft power, but also the combination of soft power with economic power and hard power. And he said it's the clever way in which you do that that really makes you successful as a country. You know how some people, you just go and look at their writings and they're just full of things that are worth quoting. Donald Trump, Churchill, various other people. Well, Joe Nye is one of them. And he basically said, in a global information age, where obviously there's a very free access to knowing what's going on, credibility is the scarcest resource. You've got to be credible, you've got to be authentic. So picking the thing which fits is key. Don't try and pretend to be good at something you're not. And secondly, ultimately, the best propaganda is not propaganda. I think that's quite a good one, really. So it's the same thing. You've got to be authentic. And I think as brand managers, your job is to try and find out what those things are and help governments and policymakers focus in on them to get the growth that I've been talking about. So with that, we will start with my fireside chat with Laura. And I think I'm allowed to ask the audience to ask questions. So I'll ask a few, and then I'll let you ask a few if you've got burning desire to ask a question about London's place branding strategy. Thank you.